The sun was a white hammer, beating down on Harmony Creek until the very air seemed to thin and shimmer. It baked the fine red dust into a powder that rose with every footstep, every gust of wind, clinging to the hems of dresses and the sweat on a man's brow. It was the kind of dust that felt like a permanent stain, a testament to the land's stubborn refusal to be anything other than what it was. Today, the town square was a theater of baked earth and ambition, staged before the proud new face of the town hall, its fresh pine boards, not yet weathered to the uniform gray of the rest of the town, smelled sharp and clean in the heat, a scent that was quickly lost in the human smells of perfume, wool, and nervous perspiration. The official occasion was the Spring Festival, but no one was fooled. It was a market day, and the prize stock was human. She sat on a raised platform under a hastily constructed awning, a throne of sorts made from 3 planks of wood set on barrels. Delaney Jacob, 19 years old, and still as a stone at the bottom of a river, watching the current of the day flow around her. She wore a dress of pale blue silk, a color so out of place against the relentless red and brown of the landscape that it made her look like a piece of fallen sky. Her mother, Martha, had insisted on it, her hands fluttering like trapped birds as she had laced the bodice that morning, her voice a low hum of anxiety. Appearances, Martha believed, were the first and last line of defense. Delaney felt the fabric stiff against her skin. It was a costume, and she was an actress in a play she had not written. From her vantage point, she had a clear view of the entire spectacle. Before her, arranged in a careful semicircle, stood 13 young men. They were the sons of ranchers, merchants, and landowners, each one polished and preened. Their boots shined to a high gloss that was already succumbing to a fine layer of dust. Each man stood beside a display of his family's wealth, a dowry in reverse. There were chests of silver coin, deeds to parcels of land, a string of fine bay horses, and even a new carriage with gleaming black paint. It was a grand, vulgar parade of prosperity. Her father, Elias Jacob, stood near the edge of the platform, his large frame blocking a portion of the sun. He was a man built of certainty and finance, a man who saw the world as a series of ledgers to be balanced. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, and he saw this day as the most important transaction of his daughter's life, and by extension, his voice, when he spoke to the crowd or to the mayor who stood beaming beside him, was the sound of ownership. It boomed across the square, a sound as solid and unyielding as the granite hills to the east. Delaney watched the men. She catalogued them with the dispassionate eye of a naturalist observing specimens, the nervous one who kept wiping his palms on his trousers, the arrogant one who met her gaze with a possessive smirk, the handsome one whose smile did not reach his eyes. Her gaze slid over them, one by one, giving each the same measured, silent assessment. The crowd buzzed, a low hive of speculation. Wagers were being laid. The odds, she knew without having to hear the calls, were heavily in favor of Wallace Blackwood. Wallace stood at the center of the arc, a position he had taken as if by divine right. He was the son of the banker, a young man whose entire life had been a smooth, upward trajectory. He was dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, a dark slash of wool in the blistering sun. Yet he showed no sign of discomfort. His gift was the most impressive scale model of a 2-story house, complete with a deed for the 500 acres upon which it would be built, land that bordered the Jacob Ranch. He was the safe choice, the sensible choice. The union of the Jacob land and the Blackwood money would create an empire, a dynasty to tame this dusty corner of the world. Wallace caught her eye and gave a small, confident nod, as if the matter was already settled. Delaney's expression did not change. Her face was a placid lake, giving no hint of the depths beneath. She felt the silence within her not as an absence, but as a presence. It was a fortress she had built 2 years ago. Stone by silent stone, it had walls, and from its ramparts, she watched the world, She had learned that words were often traps or lies. The wind, however, never lied. The smell of rain on dry earth was a truth you could trust. The patient strength in her horse's breathing was a language more honest than any spoken sentiment. Her silence protected her, but it also isolated her, turning her into an enigma for the town, an object of pity and speculation. They thought her broken. Perhaps she was, but a broken thing can be sharp. Across the square, away from the heat and noise of the central drama, Colt Hawthorne tested the weight of a new rope in his hands. The fibers were stiff and clean, smelling of hemp and possibility. He needed a good length, strong and reliable, for his work at the Miller Ranch. The old one had frayed near the end, and a man's life could depend on the integrity of his rope. He ignored the festival as much as possible. It was a peacock display, loud and full of color, but signifying nothing of substance to him. He was a man who understood the world through the palms of his hands. He knew the strain of a post-hole digger in hard soil, the rough texture of a horse's coat, the smooth, worn wood of a saddle horn. He worked for wages, moving from one ranch to another where good hands were needed. He owned his saddle, his horse, and the few possessions in his bedroll. This lack of attachment gave him a kind of freedom that men like Elias Jacob, with all their land and power, could never understand. He was not tied to one place, only to the work that needed doing. He paid the storekeeper, his movements economical and precise. He coiled the new rope with an expert flick of the wrist, the loops falling perfectly into place. Stepping onto the store's wooden porch, the noise from the square washed over him. He heard Elias Jacob's booming voice. Though the words were indistinct, he saw the semicircle of suitors and the glint of the sun on polished silver. It was a familiar story, a daughter being sold for land and influence. He felt a brief, bitter taste in his mouth and turned his attention back to his work, tying a knot, testing its hold. It was a good knot, a knot you could trust. Back on the platform, Elias leaned toward his daughter. His voice was lower now, meant for her alone, but it still carried the weight of a command. Listen now, daughter. You are choosing the future of this entire family. He gestured with a sweep of his hand toward the suitors, toward Wallace Blackwood in particular. He was presenting her with her destiny, gift wrapped and tied with a bow of financial security. Delaney felt the pressure of his words, of all their eyes upon her. The town, her parents, the 13 men who waited to claim her. She was a prize, a piece of property, a linchpin in a contract between families. For a moment, the sun felt impossibly heavy, the air thick and hard to draw. The silence inside her felt thin, like glass about to shatter. She had to anchor herself. "Yes, Father," she said. Her voice was small. A flat, smooth stone skipped across the surface of a noisy lake. But her gaze did not follow his pointing hand. It drifted. It traveled past the earnest face of Wallace Blackwood, over the heads of the whispering crowd, beyond the saloon where men who had no stake in the proceedings watched with idle curiosity. Her eyes, gray and clear as a winter morning, settled on the porch of the general store. She saw a man. He was not dressed for a festival. He wore work clothes, faded and softened by sun and labor. He was of average height and build, with no distinguishing features that would make him stand out in a crowd. Except for the quiet competence in his posture, he was coiling a new rope, his focus entirely on the task. There was something real in the simple, unhurried motion of his hands, something that cut through the stifling performance in the square. It was like a drink of cool, clean water after a lifetime of sweetened wine. He was simply a man, buying a rope, as if he felt the weight of her stare. Colt Hawthorne looked up from his knot. He paused, his hand still on the rope. His gaze swept across the square, a quick, assessing glance that took in the whole scene without lingering on any part of it. And then his eyes met hers. It was for no longer than a single heartbeat. There was no smile exchanged, no nod of greeting. They were strangers, separated by 100 yards of dusty ground and a chasm of social standing. But in that brief, silent connection, something passed between them. He saw not a prize on a platform, but a girl trapped in a cage of pale blue silk. And she saw not a nameless cowboy, but a quiet solidity, a man grounded in the real world of work and necessity. It was a flicker of recognition. A spark struck in the dry, oppressive air. And then he turned his attention back to his rope, and she turned her gaze back to the 13 men waiting for her answer, the silent fortress within her holding firm, but with a new hairline crack in its foundation. That single, fleeting glance in the town square had been a stone dropped into the still pool of Delaney's silence. The ripples were invisible to the bustling crowd, to her anxious mother and her calculating father, but she felt them expanding within her long after she had been escorted home. Back in her room, the pale blue silk dress felt like a stranger's skin, stiff and confining. She undid the laces herself, her fingers moving with a practiced efficiency that belied the turmoil inside. The dress fell in a whisper of fabric to the floor, a puddle of sky in the dimming afternoon light. She pulled on a simple cotton shift, a garment that allowed her to breathe, and went to the window. The glass was cool against her forehead. It was imported from the East, a luxury her father was immensely proud of. A clear barrier that kept the red dust of Harmony Creek from settling on his polished furniture and his daughter. To Delaney, it was just the wall of a more comfortable prison. Looking through it, she watched the ranch hands moving about, their tasks giving the end of the day a familiar rhythm. But she was not seeing them. The heat shimmering off the corral fence blurred, and the present dissolved into the chilling clarity of a memory she could never fully escape. It did not come with a crash, but with a creeping cold that started in her feet, the ghost of a dirt floor beneath them. 2 years ago, there was the rough scrape of a burlap sack being pulled from her head, the sudden blindness of a dim light in a small, windowless room. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and stale fear. She had not screamed. The sound had been frozen in her throat. She had spoken, though. She had pleaded, her voice high and thin. She had asked questions, her words tumbling over one another, striking the stone walls and falling dead to the floor. They offered no comfort, no purchase. They were just noise. The men who had taken her were shadows, their faces obscured by grime and darkness. They were not interested in her words. They were interested in her name, Jacob, a name that meant money. The memory was not a story with a beginning and an end, but a collection of sharp, sensory fragments. The icy shock of water poured from a tin cup, tasting faintly of metal and rust. The hard ground where she had tried to sleep, her body curled into itself for warmth. The sound of their boots on the wooden planks outside her door, and their voices, low and guttural, arguing over shares. Through the cracks in the door, she heard the words that changed everything. Ransom, leverage, property of Elias Jacob. In that moment, she understood. Her terror was not personal. Her identity as Delaney was irrelevant. She was a thing, a tool, a bargaining chip in a negotiation between men. Her father's success, his ambition, his grand standing in the territory. These were the things that had placed her in this cold, dark room. His name, the source of all her privilege, was also the cause of her captivity. Words had failed her completely. Her pleas meant nothing. Their words were merely the language of a business transaction. And so, the words inside her burned up, turning to ash. When her father's men finally found her 5 days later, the girl who had once been full of questions and stories had been replaced by this quiet, watchful creature. She had come home, but she had never truly returned. The fortress of silence had been her only refuge. Words were hollow, unreliable things. But the world, she discovered, spoke in other languages. She learned to read the sky, to see the subtle shift in the clouds that foretold a storm hours before it arrived. She could feel the change in the air, the drop in pressure that made the animals restless. She learned the language of the wind, whether it carried the scent of rain from the mountains or the dry, dusty promise of another scorching day. Her horse, a gentle mare named Willow, became her closest companion. In the quiet of the stables, with the sweet smell of hay and leather around her, Delaney could let the walls down. The rhythmic pull of the curry comb through Willow's coat was a conversation. The soft nicker the horse gave when Delaney brought her an apple was a statement of trust. She would lean her forehead against the mare's powerful neck and feel the steady, slow beat of her heart, a rhythm that was honest and true. It was a connection that asked for nothing and gave her a sense of peace she found nowhere else. Here, she was not Elias Jacob's daughter. She was just a girl with her horse. Her transformation was a source of constant frustration for her parents. Martha saw it as a social embarrassment, a wound that refused to heal prettily. She would fuss over Delaney, bringing her new dresses and ribbons, chattering endlessly to fill the silence, as if her own voice could somehow coax her daughters back into existence. People will talk. Delaney, she would sigh, her face a mask of worry. A quiet girl is a mysterious thing, and men do not like mysteries they cannot solve. Elias, on the other hand, viewed her silence as an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to play her part in his grand design. He would try to reason with her, his voice booming in the high-ceilinged rooms of their house. This is not healthy. Girl, the world runs on words, on contracts and agreements. You cannot build a life on silence. He did not understand that she was not trying to build a life. She was trying to survive one. Only the ranch cook, a weathered woman named Agnes Gable, who had known Delaney since she was a baby, seemed to grasp some sliver of the truth. One afternoon, as Delaney was in the kitchen getting a cool drink from the well bucket, Agnes spoke without turning from the dough she was kneading. "Heard you went from talking a blue streak to not talking at all." Delaney took a long drink of water, the cold liquid a balm in the day's heat. She watched the cook's strong hands work the dough, folding and pushing with an easy, practiced strength. She lowered the dipper and replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "Saves on spit." Agnes grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. She dusted her hands with flour and turned, her eyes shrewd and kind, meeting Delaney's, "Suppose it does. Just make sure you're not saving so much you dry up on the inside." It was the closest anyone had come to understanding. Now, standing at her window, Delaney watched the familiar patterns of the ranch unfold. The day's heat was beginning to relent, casting long shadows across the yard. The noise of the house, her mother's anxious pacing in the parlor, her father's heavy tread in his study. All of it seemed to be happening on the other side of the glass, in a world that was no longer entirely hers. Her gaze drifted toward the stables, drawn by a movement that was different from the usual routine. A man she did not recognize as one of their regular hands was working near the corral. He had a saddle slung over a sawhorse and was methodically restitching a loose seam in the leather. He worked with a patient focus, his head bent to the task, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate skill. The setting sun caught the side of his face, illuminating a profile that was unremarkable and yet utterly compelling in its quiet intensity. It was the man from the town square, the one with the rope. She did not know his name or how he came to be here. Perhaps her father had hired on a few extra men for the season. It did not matter. What mattered was the stark contrast between this image and the one from earlier in the day. There was no performance in the way he worked. He was not displaying his worth for an audience. He was simply mending a saddle because it needed mending. It was a small act of creation, of making something whole and useful again. His silent labor was a rebuke to the loud, empty promises of the 13 suitors, a counterpoint to the restless, striving energy of her father's ranch. She watched him for a long time, until the last of the sun's light had faded and he was just a silhouette against the deepening twilight. He finished his work, tested the seam with a pull, and then carried the saddle into the barn. He did not look toward the big house once. He was a man self-contained, his world defined by the work of his hands under the vast, open sky. He was real, and as Delaney finally turned from the window, the solid, silent fortress she had built around her heart felt a little less like a prison and a little more like a ruin. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Delaney's gaze returned from the distant figure on the porch of the general store, pulled back by the mayor clearing his throat at the podium. The fragile connection was severed. The heat, the expectant silence of the crowd, the weight of the 13 pairs of eyes fixed upon her, it all came rushing back. A suffocating tide. The spectacle was not over. It was just beginning. One by one, the suitors stepped forward to make their formal address. The son of the territory's largest cattle baron spoke of merging herds, of bloodlines and dynasties, his words full of bluster and pride. A young merchant, whose father owned the freight company, promised her a life of comfort, of silks from the East and furniture from St. Louis, painting a picture of a gilded cage. Each speech was a variation on a theme, a recital of assets, a promise of security, a declaration of what they could provide. They spoke to her father as much as they spoke to her, their words aimed at the man who held the true power in this transaction. Delaney sat through it all, her hands folded in her lap, her expression a careful blank. She listened, but the words were like rain on a stone, making no impression. They were speaking of a life she did not want, for a woman they did not know. They saw the name Jacob, the acres of land, the pale blue dress. They did not see the silent, watchful person inside it. Finally, it was Wallace Blackwood's turn. He stepped forward with an air of absolute assurance, the dark wool of his suit absorbing the brutal sunlight without complaint. He did not look at her, not at first. He addressed her father with a respectful nod, then turned his gaze to the crowd, as if they were shareholders at a board meeting. Mr. Jacob, Mrs. Jacob, ladies and gentlemen of Harmony Creek, he began, his voice clear and devoid of any emotion save for a cool confidence. The union of two families is the bedrock of a strong community. The Blackwood Bank and the Jacob Ranch represent the twin pillars of our prosperity, finance, and the land itself. A marriage between our houses would not be a mere partnership. It would be an alliance, a guarantee of future growth and stability for this entire territory. He then turned to Delaney, and his eyes, the color of polished slate, held hers. He offered a smile that was perfectly crafted and entirely cold. Delaney, I offer you a life of prestige and influence. Our home will be the finest in the county. Our children will carry the most respected names. I will provide for you, protect your interests, and ensure your standing in society is second to none. It is a logical and mutually beneficial arrangement. It was not a proposal. It was the reading of a contract. He spoke of her as if she were a parcel of land to be annexed. Elias Jacob beamed, his chest swelling with pride. He clapped Wallace on the shoulder, a gesture of finality, of a deal well struck. Martha let out a small, relieved sigh, her gloved hand fluttering to her chest. The crowd murmured its approval. It was the perfect match, the storybook ending. And in that moment, something inside Delaney finally broke. It was not a violent shattering, but a quiet, decisive snap. The fortress of silence did not crumble. Its gate simply swung open. She stood up. The movement was small, but on that raised platform, it was a seismic event. The murmur of the crowd died instantly. Wallace, who had been turning to accept her father's congratulations, froze mid-motion. Her mother's smile faltered. Elias's face clouded with confusion. "Delaney," he said, his voice a low rumble of warning, "the boy is waiting for your answer." She did not look at him. She did not look at Wallace. Her eyes were fixed on a point beyond them, a future she had only just begun to imagine. The pale blue silk of her dress rustled as she stepped down from the platform, her simple leather shoes sinking into the soft red dust. The sun was hot on her bare head. She began to walk. She walked past Wallace Blackwood, who stared at her as if she had turned into a ghost, his mouth slightly agape. She walked past the cattle baron's son, whose arrogant smirk had been wiped clean from his face, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. She walked in a straight, unwavering line, a pale blue vessel sailing through a sea of stunned faces. The 13 suitors, who had stood in a proud semicircle to be judged, were now nothing more than posts in a fence she was calmly stepping through. A collective gasp rippled through the townspeople. Whispers turned to audible exclamations. This was not part of the play. The actress was walking off the stage. The fine hem of her dress, so carefully protected from the grime of the street, was now dragging through the dust, gathering a border of rich, red earth. It was the color of reality, of the land itself, and it was claiming her. Her path led her away from the town hall, away from the displays of wealth, straight toward the long hitching rail in front of the stables. Several horses were tied there, shifting their weight patiently in the heat. A lone figure was untying the reins of a sturdy buckskin. It was the man with the rope, Colt Hawthorne. He had finished his business in town and was preparing to leave. A silent witness on the edge of the town's drama. He had watched her stand, watched her walk, his expression unreadable. Delaney stopped when she reached the rough wood of the fence. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her body was calm. She had spent 2 years listening to the world. Now, she would speak. She looked at Colt Hawthorne, whose hand had stilled on his horse's reins. He watched her. His eyes narrowed slightly, waiting. "I choose you," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the stunned silence of the square with the force of a pistol shot. It was clear, steady, and utterly resolute. And then, she did the most impossible thing of all. She held out her hand to him, her palm open, her fingers steady. It was not a plea. It was an offer, a contract of her own making. The reaction was immediate and explosive. A woman screamed. Somewhere behind her, there was a soft thud as Martha Jacob, overwhelmed by the sheer, public shame of it all, fainted dead away. Elias's face, which had been confused, then angry, now turned a deep, apoplectic purple. A roar of pure fury erupted from his throat, a sound of absolute betrayal. Wallace Blackwood stood as if he had been turned to stone, a monument to rejected ambition. Colt did not look at the chaos erupting in the square. His gaze was fixed on Delaney's face. He saw the fear there, deep in her eyes, but he also saw something else. Something he had not seen in the faces of anyone else in this town, a fierce, unyielding resolve. He saw a plea for rescue that had forged itself into an act of will. He looked down at her outstretched hand, so clean and pale against the dusty air. Then he looked back at her eyes. He was a man who understood actions better than words, and this was an action of profound consequence. He could turn away, mount his horse, and ride out of this mess, leaving her to face the storm she had unleashed. Or he could take her hand. He made his choice. "Then let's go," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He took her hand. His was rough and calloused, and the feel of it closing around hers was the most solid, real thing she had ever felt. In one fluid motion, he swung himself up into the saddle, then reached down and pulled her up behind him, her blue dress bunching around her legs. He did not hesitate. He spurred the buckskin forward, and the horse lunged into a gallop. They rode through the scattering, shouting crowd, a blur of blue silk and brown dust. They did not look back. The sounds of her father's rage and the town's collective shock faded behind them. They did not head for the main road out of town, but for the alley behind the general store. Colt reined the horse to a skidding halt and leaped down, leaving her on its back. He strode into the store, leaving dusty footprints on the floorboards. The storekeeper stared at him, his eyes wide with astonishment. Colt ignored him. He moved with a swift, practical urgency, grabbing a sack of flour, a slab of bacon wrapped in butcher paper, and a small tin of coffee. He threw a handful of coins onto the counter. More than enough to cover the cost. "For the road," was all he said, his voice tight. He emerged a moment later, tying the provisions to his saddle horn. He swung back up behind Delaney, his arm coming around her waist to hold her steady. "Hold on," he said, his voice close to her ear. Then he urged the horse forward again, and they left Harmony Creek behind, galloping out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open country, leaving a legend to be born in the red dust that rose and settled behind them. They rode hard and fast, leaving the settled world behind for the broken, trackless country to the west. The sun bled across the horizon, staining the clouds a violent orange and purple before sinking below the earth, leaving them in a world of deepening twilight. Delaney held on, her arms wrapped around Colt's waist, the unfamiliar hardness of his body a stark contrast to the soft, protected life she had known. The fine blue silk of her dress was no match for the journey. It snagged on sagebrush and was whipped by the wind, the delicate fabric a foolish banner of another life. The gallop slowed to a trot, and then to a walk as the horse began to tire and the terrain grew more treacherous. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. It was not the silence she had cultivated as a fortress, but a different kind, born of exhaustion, uncertainty, and the simple fact that they were strangers. What could be said? He was a man who had been going about his day, and she had thrown her life and his into chaos with 2 words and an outstretched hand. She could feel the tension in his back, the constant, subtle shifts as he scanned the landscape ahead, reading the shadows and the contours of the land in a language she did not know. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight from the town square had long since burned away, leaving a hollow ache of fear and a question that beat in time with the horse's weary steps. What have I done? Colt rode with a quiet purpose, pushing them deeper into the wilderness. He was following a path that was invisible to her, guided by the shape of a distant bluff or the course of a dry wash. He was not just running. He was running to somewhere. As full darkness fell, a sliver of moon rose, casting the world in a pale, ghostly light. The air grew cool, and Delaney shivered, the thin silk offering no warmth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reined the horse to a halt. They were in a shallow basin, a natural depression sheltered by a ring of low, rocky hills. Ahead, almost swallowed by the darkness, was the shape of a small structure. It was not much more than a shadow against other shadows, a place the world had forgotten. He dismounted in one smooth movement, the weariness of the ride not showing in his actions. "We will stay here tonight," he said. His voice was low and rough with dust, the first words he had spoken to her since "Hold on." He helped her down, his hands strong and impersonal on her waist. Her legs were stiff and shaky, and she stumbled, her fancy shoes useless on the uneven ground. The place was even more derelict up close. It was a small hut, built of rough-hewn logs and crumbling adobe, the roof sagging in the middle like a tired old man's back. A deep silence hung over it, the silence of abandonment. Colt took the horse, whose sides were heaving, and led it to a trough half filled with dead leaves and stagnant water. He upended it, then turned his attention to a nearby well. The wooden housing was gray and splintered. When he worked the handle, a protest of shrieking, groaning wood echoed in the quiet basin. The sound was so loud, so full of complaint, it felt like they were waking a ghost. But after a long moment of tortured creaking, a bucket of dark water emerged from the depths. He let the horse drink its fill before leading it to a small, 3-sided shelter that was little more than a pile of decaying logs. Delaney stood alone in front of the hut, a small, lost figure in a ruined dress. This was her new reality, a collapsing shack in the middle of nowhere with a man she did not know. The fear she had held at bay now threatened to overwhelm her. This was madness. She could have been in a fine new house, safe and secure, the wife of the most important man in the county. Instead, she was here, Colt returned, his saddlebags and the small sack of provisions slung over his shoulder. He did not seem to see the ruin and the desolation. He saw shelter. He pushed open the door, which hung crookedly on one hinge. It scraped against the hard-packed dirt floor, the sound grating in the stillness. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light making her flinch. Inside, the single room was a tomb of dust and decay. Thick cobwebs, heavy as funeral shrouds, hung from the low rafters. A small stone fireplace stood against one wall, its mouth choked with old ash and debris. In a small alcove off the main room was a crude wooden frame that might have once been a bed, filled with a mattress of straw that had long ago decomposed into little more than dust and chaff. The air was stale, smelling of mice and thyme. Colt set down his things and lit a small lantern he took from his saddlebag. The steady, golden glow pushed back the worst of the shadows, but revealed the full extent of the neglect. He looked at the room, then at her. He saw the look on her face, the way she stood frozen in the doorway, her fine dress a mockery in this place. He said nothing. He simply turned, took a long, dry branch from a pile near the door, and began to sweep the worst of the cobwebs from the ceiling. He worked methodically, his movements unhurried. When he had cleared a space, he turned his attention to the fireplace, scooping out the old ash with a flat piece of bark until the hearth was clean. Watching him, something shifted in Delaney. This was not a rescue. This was survival. And survival was not a spectator sport. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the lantern light. She saw the filth, the neglect, the emptiness, but she also saw 4 walls and a roof. It was a start. She picked up another, smaller branch and began to sweep the dirt floor, her movements awkward at first, then more sure. The dust rose in a cloud, and she coughed, but she kept going, clearing a small island of clean earth in the center of the room. They worked in silence, 2 strangers bound by a shared, unspoken purpose to carve a small pocket of order out of the chaos. He went outside and returned with an armload of dry wood. Soon, he had a small fire crackling in the hearth. The flames leaped and danced, throwing warmth and a cheerful, living light into the room. The fire changed everything. It beat back the cold, chased the last of the shadows into the corners, and made the little hut feel less like a tomb and more like a refuge. Colt went back to the shrieking well and returned with a bucket of water. He did not offer it to her, but simply placed it in the center of the clean, swept floor, equidistant between them. It was a simple gesture, but it resonated with a meaning she could not have put into words. It was a shared resource, a foundation. He unpacked the provisions he had bought. He sliced the bacon with his knife and laid the strips in a small skillet he took from his pack. Soon the smell of frying meat and then the rich aroma of coffee filled the small space. Mingling with the scent of wood smoke, the smells were so normal, so wonderfully ordinary. They were almost painful. They ate sitting on the floor, the firelight flickering on their faces. They used strips of hardtack to sop up the bacon grease, and drank the hot, bitter coffee from tin cups. The food and the warmth eased the ache in Delaney's bones. The world began to feel solid again. The man sitting across from her was no longer a complete mystery. She had seen the competence in his hands, the quiet determination in his actions. He had not offered her a single word of comfort or reassurance, but he had given her something far more valuable, a fire, a meal, and the dignity of shared work. When they had finished, and the silence returned, it was different. It was no longer a void, but a shared space, warmed by the fire. The reality of their situation remained, but it was no longer terrifying. It was simply a fact. Colt rose and gestured with his head toward the small alcove. There is straw in there. It's dry. The floor by the fire is warmer. The choice is yours. Delaney looked at the dark opening of the small room, then at the packed earth near the hearth, where the stones radiated a gentle heat. A choice, a simple, straightforward choice between 2 options. Neither one ideal, but both viable. No one was advising her. No one was telling her which was the more sensible, the more appropriate, the more beneficial choice. For the first time in her life, a decision was entirely her own. The weight of it was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was the sole architect of her own comfort, however meager. She looked at him, his face half in shadow, his expression calm and unreadable. He was simply waiting for her answer, placing no pressure on her, making no assumptions. He had given her a bucket of water, and now he was giving her this. Delaney nodded slowly, a profound sense of clarity settling over her. "A bucket of water and a choice," she said, her voice soft but steady. "That's plenty for one night." She walked to the alcove and looked at the pile of straw. It was a poor bed, but it would be her own. As she lay down, pulling a spare blanket from Colt's bedroll over her ruined dress, the sounds of the night seemed to press in on the small hut. The whisper of the wind through the rocks of the basin, the distant cry of a coyote, the steady crackle and pop of the fire. She could hear the quiet sound of Colt's breathing as he settled himself on the other side of the room. She was cold. She was sore. And she was 100 miles from everything she had ever known. But as she closed her eyes, she breathed in the unfamiliar scent of the room wood smoke and earth, coffee and the faint, clean smell of the night air. It was the first time in her life she had ever smelled a place that felt like home. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the fundamental needs of survival. The initial, frantic energy of their escape gave way to a slow, methodical campaign against decay. Together, they made the derelict hut into a place that could sustain them. They patched the sagging roof with a mixture of mud and dry grass, a messy, laborious task that left them both streaked with dirt but provided a solid defense against the elements. Delaney, whose hands had known only the smoothness of polished wood and the soft pages of books, learned the ache of hauling water, the sting of splinters from gathering firewood, and the deep, satisfying exhaustion that came from a day of honest, physical labor. They worked mostly in a silence that was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but filled with the sounds of their shared tasks, the rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood as Colt carved a new latch for the door, the steady chop of an axe as Delaney broke down deadfall for the fire, the quiet bubbling of a stew made from a snared rabbit and a few wild onions. They were a study in contrasts. He moved with an economy of motion born of a lifetime of work, every action precise and purposeful. She was often clumsy at first, her movements lacking his ingrained efficiency, but she learned quickly, her quiet observation turning into competent action. She watched how he read the land, how he could find a game trail invisible to her, how he knew which plants were edible and which were poison. In turn, he seemed to watch her, a silent assessment in his eyes as he saw the blisters on her hands form, then harden into calluses. He never offered help unless she was truly struggling, a quiet respect that allowed her the dignity of her own learning. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a relentless sheet of blue for days, began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the western horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying a cool, damp smell. It was a squall, one of the violent, fast-moving storms that could tear across the high plains with little warning. They worked quickly to secure their small camp, bringing the last of the firewood inside and reinforcing the patch on the roof. As night fell, the wind howled through the rocks of the basin, and the first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to strike the roof. The sound grew to a roar as the squall broke over them in its full fury. The wind pushed the rain in near horizontal sheets, and a cold draft snaked under the ill-fitting door. Inside, their small fire hissed and sputtered as stray drops found their way down the chimney, but it held, a small beacon of warmth against the storm. Delaney sat by the fire, watching the mesmerizing dance of the flames. Colt had taken his bedroll and gone to sleep on the small, covered porch, a narrow space barely protected by the overhang of the roof. He had done it without a word. A simple, unspoken declaration that she should have the full protection of the hut. The thought of him out there, with only a thin blanket against the driving wind and rain, was a small, sharp stone in her chest. For a long time, she did nothing, listening to the storm rage, but the image of him, exposed to the elements while she sat in relative comfort, would not leave her. This man had asked for nothing, had not questioned her insane, life-altering choice. He had simply accepted it and provided for her. He had given her a fire and a meal and a choice. Finally, she rose. Among her few possessions was a heavy woolen cloak, lined with sheepskin, a garment her mother had insisted she take on even the shortest of journeys. It was ridiculously impractical for her former life, but here, it was a treasure. Taking it from her small bundle, she quietly opened the door. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her hand, and a spray of cold rain washed over her. He was there, huddled against the wall of the hut, his back to her, a still shape in the tumultuous darkness. The thin blanket was soaked through, plastered to his back. He had not moved. He was either asleep or determined to appear so. Moving carefully, she unfolded the heavy cloak and draped it over his shoulders. The thick, dry wool settled over him, a shield against the wet and the cold. He did not stir for a moment, and she thought he was indeed asleep. She began to back away, her task complete. Then he shifted, and his head turned, in the faint light spilling from the open doorway. She saw his eyes were open. He looked at the heavy cloak, then at her. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and she pushed it away, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. "Thank you," he said. The two words were almost lost in the howl of the wind, but she heard them clearly. They were simple, direct, and held a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire inside. It was the first truly personal thing he had said to her. It was an acknowledgement, a connection. The weather between them had changed. The days that followed were different. The silence was easier, punctuated by brief, practical conversations. They began to learn the small habits of one another. She noticed he would wet his finger and hold it up to the wind before deciding which way to approach a hunt. A small, almost unconscious ritual. He noticed that she would place a small, flat stone in her pocket each morning, a silent, personal anchor. They built a better shelter for his horse, a small, sturdy structure of rock and scavenged lumber that would keep the animal safe from the worst of the weather. They fell into a routine, sharing the work without needing to discuss it. He would hunt, bringing back rabbits or the occasional grouse. She would prepare the food, stretch the skins to dry, and keep their small shelter in order. She found a surprising satisfaction in the work, in the simple, tangible results of her labor. Her hands, once soft and useless, were now strong and capable. One morning, after they had finished their sparse breakfast, Colt took out his pistol, a heavy, long-barreled Colt Army revolver. He checked the action, then looked at her. "You need to know how to use this," he said. It was not a question. He led her to a flat, open space a short distance from the hut. He set up a small, empty can on a rock 50 feet away. He showed her how to hold the gun, how to distribute its weight, how to aim down the barrel. His instructions were clear and patient. Then he stood behind her. His presence was a solid warmth at her back. He reached around her, his hands covering hers on the grip of the pistol, adjusting her hold. His touch was firm and impersonal, the touch of a teacher, but it sent a shiver through her all the same. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, smell the faint, clean scent of sagebrush and leather that seemed to cling to him. "Breathe in," he said, his voice low and close to her ear. "Let it out slow. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She did as he said. She took a breath, the front sight wavering slightly as she aimed at the distant can. She let the breath out, her world narrowing to the small space between the sight and the target. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a violent eruption of noise and force that slammed her shoulder back against his chest. The gun bucked in her hands like a living thing. The can on the rock remained untouched, Her ears were ringing. "The gun kicks like a mule," she said, her voice shaky. Colt took the pistol from her hands, his expression unreadable. "If a mule could shoot," he said, his voice completely serious, "I would be out of a job." A flicker of something, a hint of a smile, touched the corners of his eyes for a barest second. "Try again." She did, again and again. She learned to anticipate the kick, to hold her arm steady, to control her breathing. The pile of spent cartridges grew on the ground beside her. Finally, with her fifth shot, there was a satisfying clang, and the can jumped off the rock and disappeared. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, unforced smile of pure accomplishment. She had done it. She turned to him, her eyes bright. He was not smiling, but the warmth in his gaze was unmistakable. "Good," he said. It was all the praise she needed. Later that week, while she was gathering firewood near a small, sheltered creek bed, she found a patch of Indian paintbrush. The flowers were a startling slash of vibrant, fiery red against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. They were so beautiful, so defiant in their wildness. On an impulse, she picked a single, perfect stalk and carried it back to the hut. She did not know why. It served no purpose. It was not food or shelter or a tool. It was just beautiful. She put it in an empty tin can with some water and set it on the rough-hewn plank that served as their only shelf. It was a small, bright spot of color in the dim, smoky interior. When Colt returned from checking his snare lines, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the flower. He said nothing about it, but later that evening, when she thought he was cleaning his gear, she saw him take the flower from the can. He carefully opened a small, leather-bound ledger, a book he used to keep track of wages owed and expenses paid. He placed the flower between two empty pages and pressed the book closed. A debt of beauty, filed away with the practical accounting of his life. The gesture was so unexpected, so quietly poetic, it made her heart ache. He was a man who understood that some things were valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with money. And she began to wonder what other secrets were hidden in the silent, practical man who was now, for better or worse, the center of her entire world. The quiet rhythm of their days had become a fragile piece, a life built of small, essential things. The sun would rise, and they would rise with it, the shared tasks of survival pulling them through the hours until the sun set again. It was a life stripped bare, with no room for pretense or pleasantries. Their companionship was forged in the shared weight of a water bucket, the common warmth of the fire, the taste of meat roasted over an open flame. Delaney had discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed, a resilience that came not from enduring, but from doing. This peace was shattered one late afternoon by the sight of three riders approaching their small basin. They were not wandering travelers. They rode with a purpose, their figures dark and menacing against the bright, indifferent sky. Delaney's heart seized. She was outside, splitting kindling, and she froze, the small axe heavy in her hand. Colt emerged from the hut, his movements calm and deliberate, but she saw the way his eyes narrowed, the subtle shift in his posture as he became a solid, immovable object in front of their home. As the riders drew closer, Delaney's fear turned to a cold, hard anger. The man in the lead was Wallace Blackwood. He was dressed not in his fine Eastern suit, but in the practical, expensive gear of a wealthy rancher, a costume meant to convey authority in this wild country. The two men who flanked him were not ranchers. They had the hard, empty eyes of men who were paid for their loyalty and their capacity for violence. Wallace reined his horse to a halt a few yards from where Colt stood. He surveyed the scene with a contemptuous sneer, his gaze flicking from the patched roof of the hut to the small, newly built stable, and finally to Delaney, his eyes lingering on her simple, homespun dress and the calluses on her hands. "Well, well," Wallace said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It seems the wild has not been kind to our runaway bride. I have come to take you home. Delaney, your father is worried sick." Delaney said nothing. She stood her ground, the axe held loosely at her side. Colt spoke, his voice low and even, a sound that seemed to be pulled from the very earth he stood upon. "She is home." Wallace's eyes shifted to Colt, dismissing him as one might an insect. "I was not speaking to you. Hired hand, this is a family matter." He reached into his coat and produced a leather purse, heavy with coin. He tossed it onto the ground, where it landed in the dust with a dull thud. "That should cover your trouble. Now ride out of here and forget you ever saw her." Colt's gaze did not waver. He did not even glance at the money. "You should go," he said. The words were not a suggestion. They were a statement of fact, a final, unchangeable truth. One of Wallace's men shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. Colt's focus did not shift, but Delaney saw a change in his stillness, a coiling of energy, like a predator about to spring. The air grew thick and heavy. The silence stretched to a breaking point. Wallace looked from Colt's unyielding face to the cold resolve in Delaney's. He had come expecting a frightened girl and a bought-off drifter. He had found something else entirely. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You have made your choice." Then, "But every choice has consequences." With a sharp jerk on the reins, he wheeled his horse around. His two men followed, their faces sullen and angry. They rode away, leaving the purse of money lying in the dust, a testament to a failed transaction. They did not look back, but the threat of Wallace's final words hung in the air, a poison that tainted the clear afternoon light. That night, sleep would not come. Delaney lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the night, every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind sounding like the return of Wallace's men. Colt was equally restless. She could hear him shift on his bedroll by the fire, the quiet sounds of a man on watch. The peace had been broken, replaced by a tense, waiting dread. The attack came near midnight. It was not the sound of riders that woke them, but a sudden, unnatural light. A flickering, orange glow filled the small hut. Colt was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. Delaney scrambled up, her heart pounding in her throat. She looked out the small, crooked window, and a cry of despair escaped her lips. The stable was on fire. Flames, hungry and cruel, were devouring the small structure they had built with their own hands. It was the heart of their small homestead, the symbol of their shared work, and it was being turned to ash. The terrified whinny of Colt's horse, trapped inside, cut through the roar of the fire. There was no time for thought, no time for anger or fear. Colt moved. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket, plunged it into the large water barrel by the door, and, without a word, ran toward the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, a wave of shimmering air that made Delaney stumble back. "No!" she screamed, the word torn from her. He did not hear her, or, if he did not heed it. He threw the soaking wet blanket over his head and shoulders and charged into the burning stable. For a terrible, endless moment, he was gone, swallowed by the flames. Delaney stood frozen, a silent scream trapped in her chest. Then he reappeared, a dark figure emerging from the roaring chaos, pulling the terrified, rearing horse behind him. He got the animal clear just as a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flaming debris. He slapped the horse on the rump, sending it galloping off into the darkness. Safe, and then he fell to his knees, his body shaking. The wall of silence, the fortress Delaney had lived inside for 2 years, did not just crack. It was obliterated. A great, ragged sob broke from her, a sound of pure, undiluted terror and grief. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the dirt beside him. He was alive. He was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. But the left sleeve of his shirt was burned away, and his arm, from the wrist to the elbow, was a terrible ruin of red and blistered skin. She looked at his pain, at the sacrifice he had made for a horse, for their survival, and she wept. for the first time since she had been a child. She cried not for her own fear or loss, but for the pain of another. She helped him back to the hut, his arm held protectively against his body. The fire outside raged on, consuming the last of the stable. But it was a distant, unimportant thing now. The world had shrunk to this small, smoky room, and the man who was hurt because of her. A new kind of resolve took hold of her, a fierce, protective instinct. She was no longer a victim. She was a caregiver. She stoked the fire, adding wood until the flames blazed high. She put a kettle of water on to boil. Her hands, which had been trembling uncontrollably, grew steady. Her movements became sure and certain. She remembered seeing Agnes, the cook, make a poultice for a kitchen boy who had burned his hand on the stove. She remembered the broad, flat leaves of the plantain weed that grew near the creek. She took a lantern and went out into the night. Ignoring the dying fire and the shadows it cast, she found the patch of weeds, her eyes scanning the ground with a desperate focus. She gathered a handful of the leaves and rushed back to the hut. She washed them and then crushed them between two smooth stones, creating a green, soothing mash. Colt sat on the edge of his bedroll, his face pale and tight with pain. He had not said a word, had not made a sound of complaint. He watched her as she worked, his eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, something she could not read. She tore strips from a clean cotton shirt, the only thing she had that was suitable for bandages. She dipped one of the strips in the now boiling water, then let it cool until she could touch it. Her task was clear. She had to clean the burn. It would be an agony for him, and the thought of causing him more pain made her stomach clench. She knelt before him, the bowl of warm water and the clean cloth in her hands. "This will hurt," she said, her voice a low whisper. He simply nodded, his jaw set, and then he did something that stopped her breath. He extended his left arm toward her, an offering of complete and absolute trust. He was placing himself in her hands, without reservation. She cleaned the burn, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He did not flinch, though she could see the muscles in his neck and shoulders corded with tension. When it was clean, she carefully applied the plantain poultice, the cool, moist leaves covering the angry red skin. Then she wrapped his arm in the clean cotton strips, her movements practiced and sure. When she was finished, she looked up at him. The firelight flickered across his face, a face that was now as familiar to her as her own. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of what had happened, what had been risked, and what had been saved. He looked at his bandaged arm, then at her. His voice, when he spoke, was a rough, hoarse rasp. "If you want to leave," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire, "you can take the horse in the morning. He will carry you back to town." He was offering her an escape. He was giving her a choice, just as he had on that first night. He thought this life, this danger, was too much, that he had failed to protect her. Delaney looked at the man before her, at the raw burn on his arm, a price paid on her behalf. She thought of the life she had left behind, a life of silent observation from behind a pane of glass. And she thought of this life, a life of calloused hands and shared meals and a single, perfect wildflower pressed between the pages of a book. "I am not here because I was chosen," she said, her voice quiet but strong as steel. "I am here because I chose." His eyes finally met hers, and in their depths, she saw the last of the barriers between them fall away, consumed in the fire of this night, leaving only the unshakable truth of her words. In the quiet of the small hut, with the smell of smoke and herbs in the air, a vow had been made, more binding than any words spoken before a preacher. The weeks following the fire were a time of quiet rebuilding. The charred skeleton of the stable was a daily reminder of the violence that had touched their small sanctuary. But it was also a foundation upon which they built anew. They worked side by side, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken partnership. Colt, with his one good arm, could still do more than most men with two. his actions precise and economical. Delaney, now strong and sure-footed, hauled stones from the creek bed and mixed fresh adobe. Her hands no longer soft but capable and scarred. His burned arm healed slowly. Each evening, she would clean it and apply a fresh poultice, her touch gentle and practiced. In these quiet moments, a new intimacy grew between them, a bond forged not in words but in the shared language of work, care, and survival. They were finishing the new gate for the small corral, a sturdy barrier of peeled pine. When the riders appeared, there were 4 this time, and they approached not with the swaggering menace of Wallace Blackwood, but with the slow, inexorable gravity of the law. Delaney recognized her father's powerful frame in the lead, and her stomach tightened into a cold knot. Beside him rode a man in a dark city suit and a ridiculous bow tie, his face pale and unsuited to the harsh sun. 2 grim-faced men with rifles resting across their saddles followed behind. Colt set down the post-hole digger he had been using. He did not pick up his own rifle, which leaned against the wall of the hut. He simply stood before the new gate, a silent, living part of the boundary they had built. His stance was not aggressive, but it was absolute. It said, "This far, and no further." Delaney walked to stand beside him. She did not look at her father. She watched the lawyer, a man who seemed to be made of paper and ink, an alien creature in this world of rock and sky. Elias Jacob dismounted, his movement stiff with anger and a kind of aggrieved righteousness. He did not look at Colt. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, a look of profound disappointment and betrayal. "Delaney," he said, his voice the familiar boom of paternal authority. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. You are coming home." "I am home, Father," she replied, her voice steady. The man in the bow tie dismounted, clutching a leather satchel as if it were a shield. He cleared his throat. A small, fussy sound in the vast silence of the basin. "Miss Jacob," he began, his voice thin and reedy. "I am Mr. Abernathy, your father's legal counsel. I am afraid this is no longer a matter for discussion." He opened his satchel and produced a sheaf of papers, which he held out with a trembling hand. "By order of the Territorial Circuit Judge, I have here a document of legal guardianship. It states that, due to your recent erratic behavior and your demonstrated inability to act in your own best interest, you are hereby declared a ward of your father. He has been granted full legal authority over your person and your affairs. You are, in the eyes of the law, legally obligated to return with him." The words were a more profound violation than any physical threat. They were a legal cage, an attempt to erase her will, to declare her a child, an incompetent, a thing to be managed. Her choice, the most powerful and important act of her life, was being dismissed as the symptom of a fragile mind. Elias stepped forward, his expression softening into a mask of paternal concern that was more suffocating than his anger. "It is for your own good. Daughter, we will get you the help you need." "You are not well." Delaney looked at her father, at the lawyer with his piece of paper, at the 2 hired guns whose expressions remained blank and professional. This was the final assault, not on her body, but on her very self. They had come to take her mind. She turned without a word and walked back into the hut. She heard her father let out a sigh, a sound of relief, as if he believed she was acquiescing. Colt did not move, his gaze still fixed on the men. A moment later, Delaney reappeared in the doorway. In her hands, she held the heavy Colt Army revolver. She did not raise it, she did not point it. She held it cradled across her chest, her hand resting on the smooth wooden grip. It was not a threat, it was a statement. The weight of the gun in her hands was the weight of her own life, a life she had learned to defend. She walked back to the gate and stood beside Colt, the gun a solid, tangible piece of her newfound sovereignty. She looked directly at her father, her eyes clear and unwavering. "I am not your property, Father," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the legal jargon and the false concern. "I am not a name on a piece of paper. I am not a fragile mind that needs to be managed." She gestured with her free hand, a small, sweeping motion that took in the humble hut, the rebuilt corral, the vast, open sky above them. I belong here. I belong to the dust on my hands and the water in that bucket. I belong to the work that makes me strong and the quiet that makes me free. Her gaze then shifted to Colt, and her voice softened, but lost none of its steel. And I belong to the man who was willing to walk through fire for me. What law can be stronger than that? The words hung in the still, hot air. Elias Jacob stood as if he had been struck. He was a man who understood the world through contracts, ledgers, and the clear, brutal logic of power. He had come armed with the full authority of the law, and he had been met with a truth that his law could not touch. He looked at his daughter, at the gun held across her chest, at the quiet, unyielding man beside her, and for the first time in his life, he had no response. The power had drained out of him, leaving him just an old, angry man in a dusty basin. The lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, seemed to shrink inside his city suit. He took a nervous step forward, the papers rattling in his hand. "But, miss, the document, it is legally binding," he stammered. Delaney looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of pity. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "That piece of paper can't haul water from a well, sir," she said, her voice gentle. The lawyer's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His world of words and seals and signatures had collided with a more fundamental reality, and it had shattered. The two hired guns looked at each other. They had been paid to escort a girl, not to engage in a standoff with two people who were so clearly rooted to the ground they stood on. They looked to Elias for a command, but he was staring at his daughter with a look of utter, hollow defeat. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was over. Without another word, the two men turned their horses and began to ride away. The lawyer, flustered, scrambled to pack his papers back into his satchel, then scurried to his own horse. Elias stood for a long moment, his shoulders slumped. He looked once more at his daughter, not as a possession, but as a stranger, a woman he did not know and could no longer control. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, following the others out of the basin. Delaney and Colt stood together, watching them go until they were just small specks in the distance. The dust settled. The silence that returned was not the tense, waiting silence of a confrontation, but the deep, resonant silence of a hard-won peace. No shot had been fired. No blood had been shed. The battle had been won not with violence, but with the simple, unshakable power of a choice declared and defended. Colt finally looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet, profound respect. He reached out with his good hand, not to touch her, but to gently take the heavy revolver from her. He checked the action, then returned it to its holster inside the hut. The immediate danger was over. They stood at the new gate, the boundary of their small, free world. The sun was beginning to dip toward the hills, and the air was growing cool. They had been tested by family, by greed, and by the law itself, and they had held. The life they were building was no longer a fragile, desperate thing. It was as solid and real as the stones they had hauled and the wood they had shaped. It was theirs. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the small, sheltered basin turned with them. The harsh scars of their first days had softened into the familiar lines of a home. The hut, once a derelict shell, was now snug and weatherproof. Its adobe walls thickened, its roof solid. A small, sturdy chicken coop stood nearby, and the cheerful, bustling sounds of hens were a constant, lively counterpoint to the vast silence of the high plains. A vegetable garden, fenced with woven willow branches, produced rows of beans, squash, and hardy greens, its greenness a testament to Delaney's patient. Daily trips to the well, the new stable, built of stone and pine, housed Colt's buckskin and a gentle milk cow they had acquired in a trade for a month's worth of cured hides. And in the small pasture they had cleared, a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. Among them were 3 new calves, knock-kneed and curious, their coats still fuzzy with newness. They were the tangible proof of the year's labor, a small, growing fortune that represented their future. It was the calves that finally forced their hand. They were growing, and would soon need more pasture than the basin could provide. And they needed supplies for the coming winter flour, salt, coffee, and a new axe head. To get those things, they needed money. And to get money, they had to sell 2 of the calves. The only place to do that was in Harmony Creek. The morning they left, the air was crisp and clear, the sun a pale gold in the eastern sky. The journey was not a frantic, desperate flight, but a slow, deliberate procession. Colt rode his buckskin, leading the 2 calves on a rope. Delaney followed on a small mare they had bought, her posture straight and easy in the saddle. She wore a dress of sturdy brown cotton, the kind that could withstand snags from brush and be washed clean of dirt. The seams were straight and strong, the work of her own hands. On the 3rd finger of her left hand, she wore a simple band of wood, whittled from a piece of juniper, smoothed by his hands until it shone with its own soft light. It was their only ceremony, their only vow, and it was more real and binding than any ring of gold. They rode in a comfortable silence, a quiet that was no longer a fortress or a void, but a shared space of complete understanding. They had learned to speak without words, to read the landscape of each other's thoughts in a glance, in the set of a shoulder, in the slight pressure of a hand. He knew by the way she watched the clouds that she was thinking of the coming winter. She knew by the way he tested the wind that he was listening for the sounds of the world beyond their small, safe valley. As they neared the town, the familiar shape of the buildings rising from the plains, a knot of old tension tightened in Delaney's stomach. This was the place of her cage, the stage of her public humiliation and her rebellion. She had left as a piece of property, a girl in a ruined silk dress. She was returning as a woman, clothed in her own labor, defined by her own choices. They rode down the main street, and the town seemed to hold its breath. People stopped in their tracks. Faces appeared in windows. The lazy afternoon quiet was replaced by a sudden, intense stillness, followed by a low wave of whispers. The legend had returned. The runaway bride and the silent cowboy were no longer a story told over whiskey in the saloon. They were here, solid and real, riding through the red dust as if they owned the day. Delaney kept her eyes forward, her gaze fixed on the space between her mare's ears. She felt the stares like physical things, a barrage of curiosity, judgment, and grudging admiration. She saw the faces of women she had known her whole life, their expressions a mixture of shock and envy. She saw men tip their hats, a slow, hesitant gesture of respect for the man who rode beside her. As they passed the bank, the door opened and Wallace Blackwood stepped out. He froze, his face a mask of disbelief, then a dark flush of anger and old humiliation. His gaze met hers for a brief, cold second, and Delaney felt nothing. The fear, the anger, the memory of his contempt, it was all gone, burned away by a year of sun and work and the quiet strength she had found within herself. He was no longer a monster from her past. He was a stone on a path she had already walked. She simply looked past him, her expression calm and untroubled, and continued on her way. It was the most complete dismissal she could have ever delivered. They dismounted at the hitching rail near the town square, the very heart of the world she had fled. The place was almost unchanged, the dust still red, the sun still bright, but the raised platform, her former stage, was gone, dismantled and forgotten. In its place was just an open space of hard-packed earth, a place where people crossed on their way to the store or the saloon. Colt tied the horses and the calves, his movements as calm and unhurried as they would have been in their own basin. He turned to her, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you ready?" This was the final ghost to be laid to rest. She looked at the square, at the faces of the people who had gathered at a safe distance to watch them, to witness the final act of this story they had all been telling themselves for a year. She knew that what she did next would be repeated and embellished, that it would become the definitive ending to the legend of Delaney Jacob. She stepped into the center of the square, to the very spot where she had been put on display. The midday sun was hot on her head, a bright, clarifying light that left no room for shadows. She stopped, turning to Colt in the full, bright glare of the sun. He walked to her side, his presence a solid, comforting anchor. She took his hand, her calloused fingers lacing through his. The touch was a silent affirmation of everything they had built together. "I chose right," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and calm, a simple statement of fact. It was meant for him, for the man whose hand she held. But it was delivered to the world. It was the closing of a contract, the signing of a deed, the final, irrefutable word on the matter of her own life. A ripple went through the crowd, a collective sigh of understanding. The story was over. The legend was complete. Delaney did not wait for their reaction. She did not need their approval or their judgment. Her business here was finished. She gave Colt's hand a slight squeeze, and together, they turned and walked away from the center of the square. They walked toward the livestock pens at the edge of town, their stride unhurried, their purpose clear. They had calves to sell, and a life to get back to. Behind them, the town of Harmony Creek was left to its whispers and its brand new, undeniable truth. A truth that shimmered in the dusty, sunlit air long after they were gone. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.